My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. Today we're going to be talking about the surprising ways large-scale alternative energy can cause more harm than good, and how we can avoid being part of the problem.
Well, I'm Kevin Emmerich, and I actually live out in the Mojave Desert, Nevada. I've lived out here for about 30 years, and I actually was a park ranger for a number of years, and ended up here because I retired from the Park Service from Death Valley National Park. Um, for a while there, my wife and I, we've been monitoring public lands issues in the desert, and around 2008, 2009, we started to hear about a big potential land rush, which would build out a lot of large-scale renewable energy all over our deserts, and we felt that it wasn't planned very well, and it was going to result in a lot of environmental impact. So we did form this group, Basin and Range Watch, as a response to those issues and other issues that we're not giving enough attention to some of the local wild areas in the Mojave Desert and the Great Basin Desert.
It is so important to give attention to our public lands right now. There are so many threats to our public lands across the West, from unnecessary slashing and burning of pinyon juniper woodlands, cattle grazing, and even the wall's construction. So the impacts are huge, which I've really been focused on a lot lately. Since I do live in southern New Mexico, I am more familiar with the issues concerning the Chihuahuan Desert and some of the Sonoran Desert challenges as well. So today we were kind of going to focus on the Gemini Solar Project and what that's all about. And for me, this was the first time I heard about it because I don't live in the area, and there's only so much I can focus on.
Yeah.
So tell us what's happening.
Okay. The Gemini Solar Project is by far the largest large-scale solar energy project that we have been following and have been concerned about. This would be a photovoltaic project, that's solar panels, and it would be sited on 7,100 acres, 7,100 acres of land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So those are public lands. It would be located in Clark County, Nevada, approximately 30 miles or so northeast of Las Vegas, Nevada, and it would be located right along the entrance road to Nevada's first state park called Valley of Fire State Park. It would be in an area called California Wash, and this happens to be a very healthy, unbroken, and important habitat for the federally threatened desert tortoise. The area is also interestingly unique, somewhat sandy habitat, and so it supports a few rare plants as well that only grow in very limited ranges. In one particular rare plant called three-corner milk vetch, the project will eliminate about 3% of its habitat, and it's considered one of the most endangered plants in Nevada. For the desert tortoise, this project is actually quite a big impact. The desert tortoise was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1990, that is, and it's because it's overall declining throughout a lot of its range. One of the more recent reports showed that in about 14 years, in a study ending in 2014, that the desert tortoise has declined about 40% totally throughout its entire range.
Mm-hmm.
This area called California Wash happens to be one of the more healthy regions. It has a stable breeding population of desert tortoises. They're doing quite well there, and they're not seeing a sharp decline in a particular area, it should be left alone, not modified for a huge solar project. I mean, 11 square miles will really damage this. So they intend to try to mitigate this. In other words, offset the impacts by taking about 4,500 acres of that project site and not just digging it up with bulldozers, but taking these 23,000-pound machines called heavy-duty mulchers and essentially shredding all the vegetation down to the roots. And the idea is that they'll shred all the vegetation down to the roots and then allow it to grow back, and then allow the solar, and build the solar panels, put everything in there, and all the electrical cables and everything, and then allow the tortoises to re-enter the site and live under the solar panels, which is a very bold move, because you're basically taking a habitat for a species that's been identified as federally protected, industrializing it, and then allowing them to live back in there and not knowing the long-term results. And this has not really been tested at this level. There's no peer-reviewed literature that suggests this is actually going to be a working, viable mitigation for this species. So that makes it a really big concern. The area has also been identified as what they call a connectivity corridor for the tortoise, meaning that over a long period of time, over a fairly large area, if an area is left alone, generations of desert tortoises can slowly move back and forth throughout their range and spread, genetic viability. But when you develop it, block it off with things like highways, solar projects, urbanization, et cetera, that actually blocks that particular process. And that's believed to be, of course, detrimental to the long-term survival of the species.
Right. Tortoises and turtles both have experienced widespread habitat fragmentation and are basically in decline just about everywhere. But to allow this to happen when you have not only one federally threatened species is mind-blowing, even that they can try to come up with a so-called solution when there's already in place some protection laws for these tortoises. It just directly undermines the whole idea of protecting these species in the first place, which also includes habitat protection, so it doesn't add up.
Exactly, and I fully agree with this. And the thing about this is that it's so political, and there's so much money behind this particular project that the developer pretty much chose this region a long time ago. This has been in the books and planned for about a decade, and they chose the region simply because it has a good transmission infrastructure not too far away from it. So all they have to do is build a connector line and they can hook it right up. The other thing that they did is they got a purchase agreement, a power purchase agreement with the big local utility called Nevada Energy for the full 690 megawatts. That's a fairly big number for power there. And what we find really underhanded about it is the permitting agency, the BLM, really tried to accommodate the design of the developer over moving this project somewhere where it had less of an impact. We asked them, for example, we don't want the project there at all, but we said, why won't you at least review an alternative where it's only 2,000 acres instead of 7,000 acres? And they're basically coming back at us and saying, well, this is what the project developer wants. And they're essentially placing the desires and needs of this developer over the laws and the guidelines that were set in place to protect these habitats. So, yes, in that regard, it's extremely disturbing. We attended the Desert Tortoise Symposium. It's yearly conference that they put on in the Southwest, and it essentially gets all the scientists together, and they talk about the update and everything. This just happened a week ago, and to our disappointment, I mean, it's dominated by developers and consulting biologists. So the desert tortoise has become kind of a mitigation cash crop for a lot of people, and when you put a solar project in an area, you don't necessarily get everybody saying, don't do that. They see it as a kind of an opportunity to make some money off of, doing this the right way. I've often been cynical, and I've somewhat joked, and I said, well, if the desert tortoise ever fully recovers, there's not going to be a lot of work out there for a lot of people. Unfortunately, that statement rang in pretty true about a week ago when I attended that conference.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. And I think originally when I had heard you talk about this on a different interview, that originally their plan was to try to relocate these tortoises, or is that just the initial process that they were talking about?
Well, what they've done is they're talking about approving the hybrid alternative, in which case 4,500 acres would be mowed, and then the 2,600 acres would be completely graded. On that 2,600 acres, the plan is remove every tortoise off of there, put an exclusion fence around it, and then they don't get to re-enter that site, because in the plan they don't let any vegetation grow back there. They just basically scrape it clean, and it's sort of a dead zone, and they don't want the tortoises going in there. The newer alternative would be essentially shredding the plants down to the roots. They put a barrier around it, but they'll leave like an 8-inch opening under it. And so when they move the tortoises, some of them they'll hold in a facility off-site for about 1 year, and then they'll put them back and they'll let them re-enter the site.
Okay.
So I should talk about what the problems with that could
Right.
be.
I mean, tortoises have incredible navigation abilities and will always try to return home to their home ranges, back to their home ranges, and I can see a lot of problems with this already.
Yeah, in fact, my wife, Laura, she worked as a biologist where they removed some tortoises from a development site. It was about, 15 or 20 years ago. They moved one tortoise and translocated it something like 15 miles away, and it, over a period of a week, walked back.
Yep.
I mean, that's how good they are. So
they're incredible.
What will happen is the tortoises will re-enter the mowed site. The question is the quality of habitat going to be good enough for them? So they're modeling the project after another project located north of there near a small community called Pahrump, Nevada, and this is called the Pahrump Solar Project. This is an 80-acre project, and you compare that to what Gemini will be, 7,100 acres. But on this 80-acre project, they mowed all the creosote and the vegetation down to the roots, and they built a fence around it, and they put several little doorways in that tortoises could go back in. On that 80-acre site, they found 4 desert tortoises. They put transmitters on them so they could track them. It's about 4 years later or so, and they've lost 2 of them already. They're unaccounted for. So if you're going to model Gemini after the Pahrump Solar Project, already we have a 50% failure rate. When you talk about 4 tortoises, like it's a big statistical number that you can use for quantifying this thing. The other thing that happened on this project site is when they mowed all of the vegetation down, they took these really big, heavy vehicles, and those vehicles crushed everything on the site. They crushed not only the vegetation and what was living there, but all of the biological soil crust.
Right.
With the real stabilizer of biodiversity, it's like lichens, algae, fungus, etc., and it takes about maybe 100 years to grow about a centimeter. When you scrape that up, invasive weeds move in really quickly. So the Pahrump Solar Project is full of red brome grass, schismus grass, all of these exotic Mediterranean grasses that have a lower nutritional value for the tortoise. They'll eat those grasses, but it's all been studied, and it's just not as good of a quality.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the solar panels are shady. Now, shade doesn't really affect tortoise hibernation because it doesn't affect ambient temperatures inside burrows. But when tortoises come out of hibernation, they need to sit in the sun. So there's going to be a lot more limited opportunities when you shade about 2/3 of the project with shady solar panels. You know, the developers say, hey, the tortoises will like that in the summer. They'll be having the shade and it'll be cool. And it's like, come on,
They've
desert
really
tortoises
said that?
haven't needed shade for millennia. They don't need our help now,
Oh,
right?
wow. Well, that's
Yeah.
pretty ridiculous. I mean, from all sides of it, it's just much more complicated than people realize. You can't just go to the desert and then erect these things and expect everything to be okay. These tortoises are also keystone species. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the desert tortoise, it's interesting. When we just went on this site, met a friend out there a few days ago, and he was really organized, had the biology reports, and we took a GPS and walked out to this big colony. In fact, there were quite a number of them, of kit fox burrows. And so these are canines that dig, but they'll often use the desert tortoise burrows just to get their foundation started. So the desert tortoise creates a lot of habitat for a lot of other burrowing animals. Another one that's a real big one is the burrowing owl, which pretty much depends on other burrowing animals to create its shelter. If the tortoise starts to decline out there, it's going to start telling us things like, well, what I said before, perhaps that there's not as much nutrition out there because all of the plants that moved in are invasive. Maybe there won't be as much breeding of tortoises because there's too much shade on the site. What we're really worried about here, and I have followed several of these solar projects over the past 11, 12 years, is that the developer's going to immediately cry success.
Yeah.
They're going to find a tortoise that re-entered the site, and they'll go to the local news and they'll say this is working, and they'll say that probably within 6 months. And as you know, this is a long-lived animal, and it can take a few decades to really determine what kind of trends are going on.
Right.
And the reason we're worried about this is I've been talking to the BLM, and what they've been telling me is other developers are asking to start developing solar projects in conservation areas because they're saying, well, we'll mow the vegetation and it won't be as much of an impact.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to sort of get the public to realize that these kind of statements are more often unrealistic. Of course, they're going to boast some kind of beneficial outcome from land managers to developers. Anytime there's these successful projects when wildlife and wild landscapes are involved, you have to sort of question these statements.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, you know, we have to bring in the political and the climate change element to this.
Yeah.
So there are some environmental groups, for example, that are not going to talk too much about Gemini solar because it's green energy. And they want it to work. They want to find, for example, a win-win solution to preserving wildlife and developing solar on the habitat. Laura and I, and that's the other person in Basin Range Watch, we don't think that can exist. We think that's a myth.
Yeah.
But they're saying that, and in Nevada, you have to understand what happened politically last year. There's a senator in Nevada named Chris Brooks, a state senator, who introduced legislation that required all the Nevada utilities to get 50% of their power from renewables.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Senator Brooks came into the Senate from the solar industry. In fact, he's the guy who built the Pahrump solar project. Well, he introduced the legislation. It got passed because Nevada's, it's a blue state now.
Yeah.
It got passed, and lo and behold, Gemini Solar was one of the first projects to get a power purchase agreement, and Senator Brooks owns part of that project. So there's a real political connection here, and it's really about money.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are making it about climate change.
Yeah.
And climate change is a really big concern. In fact, it is part of the reason that the tortoise is declining throughout its range. But isn't it ridiculous to develop their last habitat to try to save it from climate?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And that's the complexity in this that people don't realize with this whole climate change issue, which is a real issue. But we have to also find ultimate alternatives, which is maybe need less, rely less on whatever energy sources out there. And of course, people probably have asked you, well, why haven't they built in urban places in Nevada? Like there's a small town not too far from where I live called TRC, Truth or Consequences, and they have a Walmart with a parking lot completely covered in solar panels. So why haven't they taken this route?
Well, if you talk to the big solar companies, the first thing that they're going to tell you is that's more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
We think that's BS simply because renewable energy in itself, by its nature, is environmental, and it doesn't have the footprint of a fossil fuel plant. That's kind of why we're drawn to it. But because of that, it's a little bit weaker, and it takes a lot of space. So when they go out to Nevada public lands and they go lobby a senator or a congressperson, they can immediately get about maybe 2,000 to 4,000 acres just given to them, and that takes a lot of the permitting headaches away from them. To set up a rooftop distributed generation system in the long run is much better for the economy because it employs a lot more people and it requires a lot of maintenance. The average large-scale solar farm only employs 10 people, but it takes a little longer to set it up because you're dealing with counties and different city districts and different people. And once you get it all done, you can put all of that energy back into the grid, whether it's from your rooftop or whether it's over a Walmart parking lot, et cetera, et cetera. But setting it up is the roadblock that the utility companies constantly cry to politicians about. And so they want the shortcut for public lands that makes them more money a lot more quickly.
So it's
they
convenience.
Have permitting issues with that, and they have to spend more, for example, to build remote transmission, which ends up on the ratepayers. But what they're looking for, I think, is instant gratification, quick permitting over smart planning. That would be my answer to that.
Yeah, so it's convenience again.
Right.
So what do people need to know about what stage this project is at? And at this point, I came into this scene late because, like I said, there's only so much I can follow in my region. And so tell people what stage are they at?
I didn't hear the whole thing. You just said what stage of the project, what stage is it at now?
Yeah, could you explain to people what stage of the Gemini project are we at, and is there anything that can be done still? I'm a little behind on the facts in this area.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's pretty late in the game, and we, as an organization, have had issues finding an attorney, but we are talking to some right now, and that's all I can say on that. Where it's at now is it started the summer before this last one in a scoping phase, and that was where the Bureau of Land Management put out an initial, what they call a notice of intent, to solicit comments, which everybody did. During the month of May, we had draft environmental impact statement. We had 90 days to comment on that. It got a lot of comments. Even a lot of the environmental groups who are usually quiet said, hey, wait a minute, this is really a bad one. But it only took the BLM about 2 months to put out a final environmental impact statement where they recommended this hybrid alternative that I told you
Yeah.
about. Now that came with a protest period, which some of us did, and right now the protest period is under review. So the next stage will be what they call a record of decision, and that basically when they issue that record of decision, the bulldozers can go out there. And I expect them to issue that at the end of this month. So as far as what people can do, like I said, it's late in the game. We put out a lot of alerts and that sort of thing, telling people, what to do. I would say, to answer that question right now, Gemini is a little bit difficult to get involved in specifically, but it's really a good idea to write presidential candidates, senators, and talk about public lands and how they're not sacrifice zones for renewable energy. Gemini is a tragic project, but it is one of 25 prioritized projects that the Nevada BLM put a list out just recently.
Yes.
And so there's actually quite a few more of these that are going to be planned. So this is the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. And what I, again, would recommend people do is talk to their representative and say, no more solar on public lands. The Democratic candidates are saying some good things, but some of them are saying, like, for example, Elizabeth Warren said, we want to increase renewable energy on public lands 10 times what it has been. Now, she's said some really good things, but she needs to be talked to about that. And I sent her a long letter about it.
I just wanted to interject this update. This interview was conducted just a few days before we learned Elizabeth Warren dropped out of the presidential race, but this is still good information to know.
Bernie Sanders is similar, but he wants a lot of it developed, but he's a lot better about energy democracy, putting things on rooftops. Then you get the Trump administration that doesn't really care about anything, but ironically they don't want to subsidize big solar and wind as much as some of the Democrats do. But what's bad about them is they're taking away all of our environmental review and streamlining everything. And both the solar and wind industry really like that about Donald Trump.
Yeah, a lot of laws are being overstepped.
Right.
Yeah.
It's actually both parties are kind of working against the desert in that respect, unfortunately. And that's when people say, what can I do? It's really important. You can go on our website to get some of the information too, but find out who your representatives are on both the state and federal level and say, enough of this. We don't want it on public lands anymore. There are so many rooftops. The technology is getting to the point where we can get more energy out of much smaller volumes of space. There's just no reason to do this. The utility scale model technologically is becoming a dinosaur. The other thing is storage. I do want to mention this, energy storage. California has built up so much utility scale solar that they're shutting down a lot of their plants in the daytime because they're simply feeding too much energy into the grid at the same time, and it's really hard to spread this out. So every new solar project, including Gemini, has a battery storage element where they take 10 acres and put lithium-ion batteries, which will back up the grid for about 20 minutes when everything has to be shut off because there's too much solar energy flooding the grid. And they used to do this with natural gas, but they want to do it with batteries now. So the storage element hasn't been figured out, but one thing where it does work really well is in your home.
Okay.
The largest storage, utility scale storage, is in Australia at 100 megawatts, and that can only power their grid for about 20 minutes. So we're really not there yet as far as making this efficient. If we want to save energy and we want to help the climate, we need to conserve energy. We need to go small scale, and we need to stop trying to prop up our wasteful lifestyle with
Exactly.
renewable energy. That might not even be possible.
Exactly. That's the best alternative, in my opinion. Kevin, thank you so much for talking to me about this. Is there anything else you might like to add before we wind this up?
Maybe one other thing. Southern Nevada is growing so rapidly that senators want to turn over tens of thousands of acres of other public land just to the urban sprawl developers. The desert tortoise cannot survive all of these impacts. We really have to start telling our lawmakers enough is enough. It's a big cumulative impact, and if we keep at this rate, we're going to see really big extinctions very quickly.
Yeah, well, public lands issues are always on my radar, so
Great.
Thank you for what you do. And my last question is just if you could share a story about a special connection or experience that you have made in relation to nature or with an animal.
Well, my experience with the animals that I like to experience is that I rescued an old horse that nobody wanted, and I helped her and nursed her back to health. And she's really happy. But as far as wildlife and stuff goes, I would just like to say that I have spent a lot of time in the summer in Death Valley National Park as a park ranger, monitoring and looking for desert bighorn sheep at springs. And it was really important to me because nobody else wanted to do it. So I volunteered to go hike up to these springs in the heat of the summer in the Mojave Desert, just because I really wanted to help the bighorn sheep. So that would be my story.
As Kevin points out, there's a lot more to the solar industry than we even realize. And I personally believe that those who are wanting to reduce their impact by transitioning to solar energy would want to be made aware of these impacts. Because obviously we can't help the environment by choosing an alternative that is directly harming the environment. And utilizing our public lands which support wildlife is not the answer. We need an ultimate alternative. As we said, that is probably stepping away from our overconsumption of energy in the first place. So choose your candidates wisely, and if they are not aware of these issues or these type of impacts, it is up to us who are aware to make that knowledge available to them. I do hope you can spend some time out in the sun today and receive that truly solar energy. It can definitely brighten up our mood, and as you know, it can be very difficult to battle these environmental issues. But the sun helps, so go out there and soak up some of that truly natural solar energy. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.